Hello, this is Anil Kumar from Back to the Bible radio broadcast. Today, Dr. John wraps up our current series on Matthew chapter 3 and 4, The King Goes Public, with a message entitled The Praise of the Great King. Let's turn to Psalm chapter 2. Let us read Psalm chapter 2. Why do the nations rage, and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds apart, and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, and terrify them in his fury, saying, As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned. O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now let's go back to the Bible with Dr. John Neufeld.
I think of the boasts of people. Napoleon would take the crown from the hands of a priest, and he would put the crown on his own head, saying, It is not God who crowns me. I crown myself. And then when he had served God's purposes, he stood on the battlefield at Waterloo. And God reduced him to a prisoner on the island of Elba. And as he lay dying and was afraid, the only man available to comfort him was a priest who was old and full of dementia. The sitter in the heavens laughs. Adolf Hitler said that he would build a Reich that would last 1,000 years. It was over in a decade. And Stalin, as he lay dying, had a counselor who pled with him not to die. He called Stalin, my beloved father. And the very second he died, that same counselor spit in Stalin's dead face. And Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheist philosopher who said he had wiped the horizon of every vestige of God, spent the last years of his life completely mad, his mind diseased from the syphilis he had contracted. God is not threatened by rebels. Indeed, his plans are irresistible. Psalm 115 verse 3 says it all. Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Or listen to Job's words to God. I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Now the sense of Psalm 2 should become obvious. God speaks, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. This is God's response to the war. That is what he is doing in response to the challenge of rebels. And that's exactly what David experienced. David never volunteered to be king. He was chosen, set apart, and placed in the situation of kingship. The situation goes like this. David had now been king for some time. He had built his palace, his enemies were all defeated, and his kingdom had peace. And as David, perhaps now with time on his hands, began looking around to see what was missing, something occurred to him. Here he was living in this beautiful palace, and just steps away was the tabernacle, and something was wrong. His palace was built of wood and stone, and seemed substantial, and the tabernacle was a tent. So David decides that he will build a temple grand and big enough so that his palace would never overshadow it, big enough to declare the greatness of God. And many of you know this story. In the end, Nathan the prophet announced that things were going to turn out differently than David had planned. David would not end up building a house for God. Instead, God would build a house for David. And then in this amazing word, on which the entire Old Testament turns, God announces that he will establish David's throne and his kingdom forever. David would have a greater son who would rule on his throne, and this son would rule all the nations. It turns out that King David and his kingdom was only a symbol or a type or a foreshadowing of the greater king whose kingdom would rule all kings. And in reality, Psalm 2, the entire psalm, is in fact this promise put into the form of poetry. David himself tells of what happened. Verse 7 to 9 reads as follows, I will tell you the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage. What you have here is a description of God's unstoppable plan for the nations. How is God going to accomplish his defeat of the enemies? Well, for one, God could very simply say to his enemies, be no more. Or he could keep frustrating their plans as he's done from the beginning. But what we find is that God's rule will be exercised in a very particular way. He will install the Messiah. Now, we've already seen that David is a foreshadowing or a type of the Messiah. If God told David, you are my son, what did God mean? Well, according to 2 Samuel 7:14, it says, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. That expression is elsewhere found in the Old Testament. For instance, in Psalm 103, it tells us, as a father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on us. All that David knows in 2 Samuel 7 is that he knew himself to be the object of God's fatherly love. But according to Romans 1:4, Jesus was declared to be the Son by his resurrection from the dead. Now, to be sure, Jesus was always the Son, but at his resurrection, when he destroyed death itself, the kings, the princes, the leaders, the presidents, prime ministers, and for that matter, the doctors, lawyers, carpenters, mums and dads, and everyone else heard the decree, you are my beloved Son. God had installed his king on his holy hill. But for what purpose? In Psalm 2 verse 8, the purpose is given. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage. Unlike David, who ruled only a small area of the world, this son will ask the Father, and this son will rule all the nations. No rebel will stand against him. I remember walking through that square in the city of Timișoara that marked the end of communism in Romania. I walked there with a pastor who told me of the horrible history of that place, as the communist dictator ordered that all Christians gathered in that square on a certain day were to be shot on the spot, and how the army began to do what they were commanded and then suddenly quit, and how this led to the end of the brutal tyrant Ceausescu and the end of his atheistic reign. Then this pastor said to me, and I'll never forget this word, he said, this is the end of everyone who will not bow the knee to Christ. See, the real question is this, who is Jesus? He is either the rightful heir of David's throne or he is not. He is either the Messiah of Psalm 2 or he is not. He is either the one before whom every knee must bow or he is not. And if he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he is to be feared. And according to Romans 1:4, this matter was settled 2,000 years ago in a newly cut tomb when the badly whipped and tortured and lifeless corpse of Jesus of Nazareth was laid into a tomb, and he, by the power of an indestructible life, broke through the prison of death itself and laid in broken and tattered ruins the kingdom of Satan. By this one act, a proclamation was issued throughout the universe. He reigns by the eternal decree of the Father. You know, as we studied Matthew 3 and 4 and entitled those two short chapters, The King Goes Public, we should reflect on what those early days of Jesus really meant. People were now hearing of him casting out demons and raising the dead, and his fame was growing, and all Galilee was going to where he was, and people were coming from Syria and Tyre and Sidon and the Decapolis and Judea and Jerusalem. And this was but the beginning. This was but a mustard seed planted in a garden. This beginning, however, would one day branch out and rule the world. And what should we do with that knowledge? Psalm 2 verse 10 and following says, Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord. Kiss the Son. Blessed are all who take refuge in him, lest his anger break out and you are destroyed in the way. See, the wise should respond to the nature of things. I mean, the nature of things is clear. God rules. The nations want to overthrow his rule. God laughs. He installs his king, King Jesus the Messiah, who will one day rule the nations with a rod of iron. That's the nature of things. What then should you do? You should serve the Lord. One songwriter wrote, "We can serve the Lord for love, or we can serve the Lord for fear. But refusing his commands is not a choice we ought to bear." Indeed, take this to heart. And here's the good news. When the great king went public, he had compassion on the crowds. He healed their sick and drove out their demons. He was loving. And he told us to stop building our house on the sand and build it on a rock. But never forget that the one who loves deeply is also the great king installed by the Father on his holy hill. Rebels may band against him, but this king will prevail. Once the king went public, his kingdom would never end. Indeed, his kingdom is destined to rule the world. That is the force of history. And that brings us back to the place where I began. O great king, who is going to rule all things, what is man that you are mindful of him? Why is it, you whose reign is so great, that you took the time and still take the time to be compassionate and merciful to all who take refuge in you? How is it that your mercy is so great? And that's the question of the king. Oh Lord our God, thank you for Jesus, that he in this time has spread his mercy and his grace, lavished it upon us. We thank you for this.
As we continue to listen, Dr. John will examine how God responds to rebellious people and how he comes to save and to redeem. Back to the Bible, leading people into a dynamic relationship with God.